Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we are going to be discussing recent rumours that the Wii U has received an update which has drastically boosted its CPU and GPU speed. How much, I hear you cry? Well, I believe this quote can best sum it up. This quote comes to us, and this rumour indeed comes to us, from a poster on TV Tropes. And he hasn't cited his sources, but indeed is fairly adamant that this is true from wherever his sources are. And let's read the quote anyway. CPU, IBM PowerPC 7XX based tri-core processor Espresso, clocked at 1.24 GHz before the 3.00 update, 3.24 GHz after the 3.00 update, is an evolution to the Broadway chip used in the Wii, and is 64-bit and uses Power 6 Tech Note. When IBM said that Nintendo had licensed Power 7 Tech from IBM, Nintendo is not using it for the Wii U, explaining its backwards compatibility. GPU, AMD Radeon high-definition graphics processor, codenamed Latte, with an EDRAM cache built into the clock, into the die, and clocked at 550 MHz before the 3.00 update, 800 MHz after the 3.00 update. End quote. So, that's a lot of speed. We're looking at well over twice the clock speed for the CPU and a substantial boost in the GPU clock speed. So I believe the best way we can answer this question of is it true is, well, a couple of prongs to the attack, if you will. The first question you have to ask is, have Nintendo been playing possum? In other words, were they pretending that their clock speed was lower than what the actual chip could really do? The second question is it even possible? Now, first of all, let's get a few rumours out the way first. I have been reading around the internet. By the way, this rumour comes to me, or was mentioned to me by a viewer, so thanks to him. I'm assuming it's a him anyway. And I was looking around the internet, and a few people have quoted and spoken on forums and so on, and you know what forums are like before anyone even comments on that. They are not necessarily true, although sometimes some of the biggest things in the world could be created in forums, you know, various big discoveries and so on, glitches in games and so on. And several have stated that they have noticed speed increases on the Wii U after the update. So I think we're going to also cover alternative reasons for this later on. So the first thing is it possible Nintendo have been playing possum? Well, this isn't a particularly easy question to answer. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Firstly, the CPU inside inside the Wii U isn't 100% confirmed. In other words, we know what it is, we know it's an Espresso CPU, but it's not necessarily that the actual specifications are 100% accurate. It has been designed by IBM and Nintendo, and does indeed feature a 45 nm die size, and is PowerPC. We know all that. We do know, I'm pretty damn sure, it's a 3-core CPU, and of course we know it's for the Wii U. But there are certain things that are not 100% known. We're not 100% sure that the actual clock speed of the Wii U CPU is actually 1.24 GHz to begin with, although we're pretty darn certain. It's actually kind of funny because even on Wikipedia and a couple of other websites, they've already started to put the rumours in. 3 cores at 1.24 GHz, after 3.0 update, 3.24 GHz overclocked. So, firstly, you've got to ask yourself, were Nintendo playing possum? Was the CPU actually capable of running this speed anyway? Well, there's two ways to look at this. The first is that it's not actually overclocked. And I know that sounds a bit weird, but hear me out. For example, there is what is known as power saving functionality and so on. Now, this could be clocked a couple of different ways. the obvious one and the most likely would be the multiplier on the CPU. The second would be the system bus. I highly doubt it's the system bus because of the way the CPU and everything else would be affected. I don't think it would be. It's most likely the multiplier on the CPU is simply been increased. Now, I don't know what the multipliers are, I don't know what the FSBs are, and so on, but let's assume that that's the route they've gone. Now, I have no doubt at all that over the next couple of weeks there's going to be some substantial checking on this. One way that they could confirm, I simply can't because I don't actually have a Wii U, but one simple way that people could most likely figure this out would be to start looking at the Wii U to see if it's drawing either more power, and I'm talking about the CPU/GPU combination here, see if they're drawing more power or see if they're putting out more heat. Either of those two is a possibility. So, what did I mean by the fact that it's not technically overclocked? What I mean by this is that the actual proper clock speed is 3.24 GHz, and beforehand it was just underclocked. In other words, it wasn't running at its truest potential. An example of this is that if you happen to have any power saving functionalities on any modern day desktop CPUs, for example, my 2500K on my PC, you know, it quite simply lowers its clock speed. If it's not doing anything, it just basically runs at, substantially less. On the other hand, then it will start ramping up its speed if the CPU feels like, you know what, I actually need to work a bit faster because I'm being put under some heavy strain. So, for example, and these are purely made up numbers, your CPU could go from example 1.4 GHz, 1.5 GHz, and then ramp all the way up to say 3 GHz or 3.5 or 4. And the simple reason is that power saving and so on. There is that possibility with the Wii U. In other words, they just decided, you know what, we don't want to reveal what we actually really got because we're going first. It's worth noting, as an aside for a second, that a couple of developers have already noted and actually said prior to the update that they feel that the CPU of the Wii U is very slow. And, I'm not a developer, I haven't developed for the console, so I'm just reading what they're saying, and they have said that they feel that the system is very slow, the CPU, compared to other consoles, because obviously they're winning the clock speed war. There have been another developer recently that has actually gone on record and has said that he doesn't believe the Wii U is a next generation system. If you guys want to Google that, I'll probably do an article as well. But this one is from Insomniac, and they are not working on the Wii U. And the CEO, Ted Price, said he's excited about the next generation, but he doesn't consider the Wii U one of the next generation systems. So, once again, it's possible that, well, they have been playing possum, and it could be somewhat smart of them. Now, I know what you're going to yell. Has there been any evidence of this before, of any other consoles? Yes, there have been a couple of systems that either overclocked themselves, or from updates, or indeed actually run faster in certain conditions. A very simple example of this actually is the Vita. And a couple of websites have reported after doing some testing that the actual GPU, I believe, of the Vita overclocks itself if you're not if you don't have Wi-Fi enabled, because they believe it's the extra power requirements of Wi-Fi. They don't want the battery to die in 3 seconds flat. Believe it or not, even the PlayStation 1 can be actually used at overclocked. Genesis 2, as well as a number of other systems. I'm not going to go too much into that, however, in this particular video. And for the most part, the mods, although sometimes you actually need a bit of hand cooling in them, in other words, than adding a fan or whatever, it does work. That doesn't necessarily mean that this rumour is true. I'm always skeptical about these type of rumours that originate on the internet. Why? Because, well, quite simply put, Nintendo haven't confirmed it, and there hasn't been any major sources. He hasn't said that, I work for Nintendo, but I don't want to reveal my sources. He hasn't said something like, I work at Nintendo, here's a shot of the code that has changed. I can't reveal how I know this, all I can show is this piece of code And this is where, this is modified, and obviously you can update clock speed and so on via software. That's not a problem. So, once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. I would just be very skeptical that it is true. I want to see some evidence, and I would take evidence on either, extra heat being generated, extra power being utilized, that type of thing, or maybe even Nintendo just admitting it. I mean, if I were Nintendo, I'd go on record. I don't know about you guys, but let's say that you had a system and everyone's been like, lols, Wii U speed. And no offense to anyone who owns a Wii U, but let's face it, people right now, Nintendo right now are trying to get rid of the image that the Wii U is underpowered. They've even said that themselves, and they said that people believe the Wii U's underpowered. Okay, if I'm Nintendo and suddenly I was just like, oh, by the way, guys, we actually are able to run our console, 2.5 times whatever it is faster than what we originally did that on. So hi, I would certainly announce that. I don't know about you, but I would be really, really, really happy to announce that. And also, I don't necessarily know if it makes sense. I suppose, from their perspective, it means that the system scales better with age, or maybe that, as I said, you're playing possum for your, for your competitors. But I don't know about that. I'm not saying it's not true. Incidentally, I don't have evidence one way or the other. The second option is, let's assume that it is indeed overclocking. Is this even possible? Well, yes, it's not like it's impossible. For example, overclocking 1 GHz or whatever, although it's far more than 1 GHz, of course, is about 2, is possible for CPUs. Once again, it depends on how good the thermals are, in other words, how much heat that you can dissipate. But for example, the 2500K from Intel, just for this pure example, runs at 3.3 GHz when it's not running flat out. In other words, when it's just acting normal. However, assuming you've got turbo enabled, which I'm assuming most people do, it can actually go up to 3.7 GHz. Now I know you're going to scream, but that's not anywhere near 2 GHz. What are you talking about, you crazy person? However, there have been cases on air, in other words, not using extravagant cooling, where you can actually get it to like 4.5, which is what mine's running at, 4.6, so I can even get it running out if I so wish, and 5 GHz plus. So there's that. There's also other CPUs in history. For example, Intel's 300, Celeron 300A, which can actually run at 450 or even 500 megahertz if you're quite lucky. Once again, that's a pretty significant clock speed improvement. AMD's Venice as well, the Venice series, which was 64-bit, one of the very first 64-bit processors actually. My own personal one, I believe the default, I think I had the 3000 Venice, and I think the default clock speed is 1.8, and I got all the way up to like 2.7. So once again, large clock speed increases are not unheard of. The problem is this even possible? As in, can the chip even withstand that type of punishment? And I think, to be honest, this isn't going to be, in my opinion, although people are calling it an overclock, in my opinion, it's most likely not an overclock. In my opinion, it's more likely that the chip was actually designed to run, or was possible to run this. For example, let's say that it ran at 1.2 gigahertz. I'm not going to bother to keep saying 1.24 for the sake of my sanity. Let's just say it ran at 1.2 gigahertz. And let's say that Nintendo were to do some internal testing, and they were to say, okay, we've been testing a variety of these consoles. They'd probably have a variety of these systems set up in different temperature environments. So in other words, one in a fairly cool environment, say an AC controlled room, one in a warmer room, one in, say, a very hot climate, or simulating a very hot climate anyway. And they would say, okay, so we know that the ambient temperature ranges from X to Y. Let's start overclocking these Wii U's and see what speed we can actually get the system up to stably in an environment and then add some headroom in there. For example, let's say you were to do an update and it bricks the system 2 days later, 3 days later, because the CPU is not designed to overclock or not designed to run at that speed. In other words, now you've suddenly got 50% of your users pissed who live in hot countries because, you know, the CPU just wasn't able to handle it, and therefore, you know, after a bit of dust and stuff has actually managed to settle in the system, suddenly you have very angry customers. There's that possibility. So let's assume, however, that they did do their internal testing and they were to say, okay, it runs at 1.2 gigahertz. After all our initial testing and our safety concerns and so on, we're going to say that the CPU can be overclocked, let's say 200 megahertz, just for example, just to give us a nice round figure. Actually, let's make it 300 megahertz. Let's say 1.2 and 1.5. They're easy to remember figures, right? So I could buy that. I could say, okay, I can see where you're going with that. It's an officially sanctioned overclock. In other words, they did it themselves. Most likely covered, well, it would be covered under warranty. I can see that. You know, I'd be like, okay, that's definitely possible. That is an overclock to me on a, you know, console. However, this is not an overclock to me. It was, you know, intentional. So let's talk about the GPU for a second. I've really heavily discussed, by the way, the Wii U's architecture previously in other videos, so I'd recommend you check those out. Now, the Wii U's GPU is running at 550 megahertz, and they claim it goes all the way up to 800 after the update. That's once again a fairly substantial meatball. That is not, you know, a 50 megahertz increment or something like that. NVIDIA, for example, and AMD definitely have similar technology, have what is known as Boost, and Boost allows the actual GPU to start increasing its speed based upon a number of factors, but mostly power and heat. In other words, if the GPU is running cool enough and has enough power, then it will start increasing its clock speed up to a certain point. Most people will say that, for example, it might boot, let's say, for example, your standard, I'll just make figures up, are 900 megahertz, then it might boost up to 1 gigahertz, and most of the time they advertise that, so they'll say that, okay, we advertise that it can boost up to 1 gigahertz from 900 megahertz. A lot of the time it could actually go higher than that, actually. Some people have actually reported 1100 megahertz and whatever, simply because of their temperatures are good and so on. For example, my graphics card, which is a GTX 670, I have an EVGA for the Win version. I can actually get it to boost to something along the lines of 1350 megahertz, something like that. I believe the default clock speed is around 1000 megahertz. So yeah, I haven't really done too much testing. I haven't actually had much need, to be honest. The graphics card's so bloody fast that, well, I haven't really needed to actually overclock it too much. But so really, to be honest with you, the default boost is more than sufficient. But as I was saying, yeah, you know, that's a 300 megahertz overclock right there. However, once again, we are looking at a clock speed that's significantly higher. We're looking at, you know, 1000 megahertz compared to like 550. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't. However, I have owned graphics cards in the past where I've gone from like, you know, 550 megahertz to like 700. Once again, however, I don't really think that this would be overclocking. My personal gut feeling is they would not risk overclocking so much. It's not a few percent, it's not like 10%. For example, I've always said, you know, if anyone asks me how much, you know, speed can I get out of my graphics card memory, just for example, I always say that generally speaking you'll get 10% minimum. That's not to say that 10% will be the ceiling, but I always say that, you know, try to go 5 to 10%. And then go from there, because generally speaking you've got at least a 10% headroom over what the initial settings were, and then, you know, you're generally safe. So for example, let's say that your core speed or your memory speed of 1000 megahertz, personally when I overclock, and I emphasize when I overclock because overclocking is dangerous and all the other disclaimers that you would hear, because I don't want, you know, if your graphics card explodes, it's not my fault. I personally go from like 1000 megahertz to 1100 megahertz and test it out. I will do so first on the core, then on the memory, and see what happens. But I would not go from like, 1000 megahertz all the way up to like 1300 megahertz, or indeed from this case 550 megahertz all the way up to 800. That's a substantial amount. That's not like 50 megahertz or something. That's substantial. You're looking over 200 megahertz increase. Anyway, once again, these are just rumors. There has been no substantiated evidence yet, apart from a few wiki pages that have been updated. A couple of forum posts. However, once again, there may be an element of truth there. Here's a couple of alternatives other than these clock speeds I've mentioned. The first is there have been an increase. It could be a smaller increase. It could be, for example, the GPU has been overclocked to, let's just say, 620 megahertz from 550. It could be that the CPU has gone from 1.24 all up to, I don't know, for example, 1.5, just for example. Another option would be that the update itself is more efficient. So in other words, the update has, for example, given more memory to games. We know that the Wii U actually severs off quite a lot of its memory. The Wii U actually has 2 gigabytes of memory. However, and you always like that word, there is a certain amount of memory that's actually allocated, reserved, in other words, for the operating system. How much? 1 gig. So literally 50% of the memory. It's possible that Nintendo have realized that this is a rather obscene amount of memory. When a system's only got 1 gig, to say 50% of, sorry, 2 gigs, to say 50% of that is unavailable for anything else other than the operating system is pretty damn big. It's possible that they've managed to wrangle another, just for example, 100, 200 megabytes of memory available for the games. That's possible. How could they do this? Many different ways, efficiencies in code, it unloads stuff, whatever. Once again, there would be testing most likely to be done on this. It could be code compression has been done, maybe lossless compression of, say, certain parts of the operating system. It could even be that certain parts have become more efficient, certain parts of the code have been compressed. For example, let's say there is a statement in the code that has consistently been used. It could be, rather than constantly having that piece of code in the memory, they simply have one piece of code and it's referenced throughout. It could be that simple one piece of one simple example. It could be, I'm not saying it is, it could be efficiencies on the drivers as well. So for example, obviously the GPU and CPU and everything else, they have drivers in them. The operating system will actually know how to handle those. It could be improvements on that, which maybe have somewhat improved things. It could be the gamepad and various other bits and pieces are using less CPU cycles. It could be dozens of different things which are contributing to this. And I know that's not really narrowing it down for you guys, and I would love to. But once again, I have a few issues. One, I don't own a Wii U, and, so it's a bit difficult. So that one pretty much, kills it in the head. And also, I don't own a voltage meter. Don't ask. It's a long story. Mine broke. But, no, I didn't try to, test lightning or something on it before anyone asks. So yeah, I personally would expect over the next couple of weeks that this rumor will most likely be resolved. And although I don't ever assume that we're going to get 100% conclusive evidence, let's say someone owns a Wii U now, and let's say, for example, the operating temperature of the die which contains the GPU and the CPU. Let's just say when it's playing a game, it gets to 50 degrees, and let's say after the update, it gets to like, say, 60. That would give me evidence that the CPU and GPU are either pulling more more power, or producing more heat. Well, both basically. So in other words, it could be that the clock speed's increased. However, that obviously doesn't give us an exact amount, but that would be a very rough way to do it, I imagine. Anyway, I know this has been a pretty inconclusive video. However, that's the problem with rumors. They are very, very hard to debunk, especially when they're so general as this. I'm not really that general, but anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video, and it's certainly an interesting one. I'm actually kind of hoping it's true. people have wrote off the Wii U as being very underpowered. It would be quite entertaining if, in actuality, Nintendo were playing a huge possum. My biggest issue with this, however, and I know that Nintendo are typically very coy with their specs. The original GameCube is a fantastic example of this, incidentally. The original GameCube was incredibly powerful. It was cheap and very powerful. But they didn't actually advertise it. In fact, to be honest, they were completely contrary to that. They actually undersold how powerful the Wii U was. Undersold how powerful the GameCube was. And indeed were incredibly conservative with the actual performance of the estimates of the hardware. So developers were saying, as later on, obviously, they became more and more used to the system. But in this case, when so many people, developers, gamers, press, are looking at the Wii U as if it's the dunce in the room. No offense, once again, I don't mean this in a nasty way, I'm just being honest. That's kind of the issue that they're facing right now. Many people consider the system to be really underpowered, considering that the PlayStation 4 and most likely the Xbox is going to be roughly around the same neighborhood of the PS4. Even if you say take 25%, so in other words, it's 25% less powerful than PS4. Once again, that's only a example. I'm not saying it is. Even if you say it was 25% less powerful than the PS4, it's still a significant improvement over the current generation, and most would assume and say that the Wii U is part of the current generation in terms of performance. So if I were Nintendo, I would want to destroy those myths by saying, hey, you know what, guys, in actuality, our system runs at 2.5, whatever it is, times faster than, we originally led on, because we were playing possum to Sony and Nintendo. I certainly would be very happy to announce that personally if I were Nintendo. The other possibility, of course, is they want to hold out, wait to see what Microsoft are doing. This update was just to get things ready for the unveiling, and then they could start their own marketing campaigns or whatever. That's another possibility as well. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. I think I've just about covered it from every angle possible. Once again, this tip comes in from me from a viewer, so I'd suggest, well, thank you very much to him or her. I'm assuming it's a him. And I know it's pretty much impossible for me to keep on top of every single rumor and so on. So if you guys know of any more, send them in. Once again, I am best to attack on either YouTube messaging, so either inbox me. I'm not the greatest at responding to video comments. It is no offense to you guys. It's not that I don't appreciate views or comments or any of that stuff. It's just that we have a lot of videos. We have a huge workload on. Amata and myself, as well as everyone else involved, actually all work, and so it's incredibly difficult. I personally right now I'm busy trying to sort out web hosting and some other issues and site design and a few other bits and pieces, so it's incredibly difficult for me to actually view all the comments. So your best bet, if you want to stalk me, it would be Facebook. That would be facebook.com/redgamingtech, or stalk me on YouTube, which you can easily click on because you're watching this on YouTube. Anyway, I will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.